Welcome to the Right on Crime webinar. I'm Mark Levin. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm the Policy Director for Right on Crime and Director of Center for Effective Justice here in Austin, Texas at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And we are so pleased to have all of you with us here today at this really historic time when it comes to criminal justice reform. We are seeing across the nation many states, particularly those conservative states, over the last several years enact tremendous reforms that increase public safety, reduce costs, empower victims of crime, and make sure we rein in the scope of criminal law so that we don't criminalize ordinary business and recreational activities. And so at this webinar here today, we'll have the chance to go through some of our recent successes, as well as some of the opportunities going forward, and of course take questions from those of you watching, which I think will be the most important part of the program. And of course later joining me will be Joe Lupino Esposito, who's Right on Crime's Washington Director in Washington, D.C., who's been spearheading our efforts when it comes to the action on Capitol Hill, the various reforms pending at the federal level. And then also Ken Cuccinelli, of course, one of our top signatories to the Right on Crime Statement of Principles, the very distinguished former Attorney General of Virginia, who I know has a very busy day with Virginia voting today, among other states. So we're so pleased he'll be joining us momentarily. But let me just start with talking about where Right on Crime began, and of course that's right here in Texas. And it stemmed from, I started in 2005 working here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, beginning our criminal justice program. And at that time there was virtually no one on the right engaged in this issue, and now we have our friends at Americans for Tax Reform and Freedom Works, and several state-based free market think tanks like ourselves, like the Illinois Policy Institute, who have a full-time criminal justice person. But when we first started, it was really just us when it came to the right and criminal justice reform. And so we, as many of you know, in Texas, in 2007, we faced an estimate that we would need to build 17,000 prison beds, a cost of over $2 billion to build and operate over 5 years. And instead, we worked with legislators here, including our senior fellow, former Texas House of Corrections Chairman Jerry Madden, to develop an alternative justice reinvestment plan. And the proof's in the pudding. We've seen a decline in Texas of our crime rate by some 24% since we began, as well as a drop in our incarceration rate of 12%. We've closed 3 prisons. And of course, on the juvenile justice side, it's really incredible to see what's happened not only in Texas but across the country. If you look nationally, not only has juvenile crime continued to decline over the last 15 years, but over the last 15 years, the juvenile incarceration rate has dropped 40%. Here in Texas, we've closed more than half a dozen juvenile facilities, and many more have closed in states throughout the country. So what we did, building on the success in Texas in 2010, was launch Right on Crime. And we developed a statement of principles that's been signed by not just Ken Cuccinelli, who has joined us, but also Bill Bennett, the former drug czar, Jeb Bush, and Newt Gingrich, countless other conservative leaders, J.C. Watts, who just led the Colson Task Force, which produced a really, I think, valuable report. And so this has enabled us to really spread this effort across many states. And I think coming from the conservative perspective, we bring a unique credibility to this issue because everyone knows Texas is tough on crime, but it's obviously a matter of being tough and smart and making sure we're locking up the people we're afraid of, not those we're just mad at. And so there's reasons, I think, why many on the left were particularly in, I think, the late 60s, saying that we shouldn't lock anyone up and that society causes crime, not individuals. And so there was a big reaction against that, justifiably so, particularly on the right. And then I think what we see now is the pendulum swinging back to more of a happy medium and saying that, yes, we need to hold people accountable who violate the law, but it doesn't necessarily have to be prison. And of course, what we've also seen is a growth in the research. Many new techniques, whether it's drug courts or electronic monitoring or non-narcotic treatments for opioid addiction that literally block the receptors in the brain. And of course, that's a topic going on in Congress with pending legislation to deal with the heroin crisis. And so, and of course, risk and needs assessments, actuarial instruments to better match the right offenders with the right programs, figure out who is really a danger. So we've seen all these advances, and I think that that has made a major difference as well. So let me just highlight the major areas that Right on Crime continues to focus on. And I think the threshold issue is what should be against the law to begin with when we first start talking about criminal justice. And that really is the issue of overcriminalization, as well as increasing the over-federalization with more than 4,500 federal criminal laws. But we have sought to repeal silly criminal laws. As we've said before, in Texas, we have 11 felonies relating to harvesting oysters. At the federal level, there's all sorts of bizarre offenses that certainly should be eliminated. And the other thing is we need to make sure that there's a culpable mental state requirement for conviction of a crime. And over the last couple of years, we've been able to spearhead efforts working with our free market think tanks in those states to pass default mens rea provisions in Michigan as well as Ohio. And so then when after we've dealt with that, the next stage in the process is policing. Who should be arrested? Are there certain offenses that it makes more sense to issue a citation and summons, which we've worked with sheriffs here in Texas to pass that law in 2007 for certain minor misdemeanors, and also making sure we're using the data-driven, the CompStat policing, what's been so effective in New York City, and then finally dealing with the issue of civil asset forfeiture, which is really motivating conservatives across the country, because here you have a situation where people's property is confiscated, even though they're never convicted of a crime, and they have to bring a civil lawsuit to get it back. And some of these cases are like, 1999 Chevy versus the United States or versus some state, and the cost of hiring a lawyer to get your property back when you've never been charged or convicted exceeds the value of that property. So fortunately, many states have acted. We supported the effort in New Mexico, which succeeded to abolish civil asset forfeiture there. Of course, police can still seize those items, for example, with drug cartels, and hold those, but then once there's a conviction, then you actually have the transfer of title of that property to law enforcement, which is truly the American way of innocent until proven guilty. Now, then, of course, for those things that really should be crimes and that we should be arresting people for, we look to what is the appropriate punishment, and we need to make the sentence fit the crime. And that's why we've supported efforts, of course, to address the issue of mandatory minimums, particularly for nonviolent offenses. And many states have acted to roll those back, including Georgia, for example, at least putting a safety valve in place to, when there's certain circumstances, for example, it's a first-time offense and things like that, the judge could consider those for drug offenses and go below the mandatory minimum. And so that's been very important as well. We also, in Texas, this past legislative session, were able to adjust the property offense thresholds for inflation. So we're not on an autopilot where something, the same thing stolen 10 or 15 years later is now a felony instead of a misdemeanor just because phones are more expensive, for example. But also making sure we prioritize victims, and that's been a central part of our effort, particularly making sure restitution is actually ordered and collected, which is really a challenge. And of course, what the data shows is those individuals on probation are paid 99 times more restitution than those who are incarcerated. Now, it doesn't mean that people should never be incarcerated, but for various property crimes such as shoplifting, hot checks, the individual, if they're holding a job, for example, is much more likely to be able to make that restitution. And we believe the restitution payments to the victim should be prioritized before any fines and fees collected by the government. And unfortunately, what we're seeing in too many places is these fines and fees becoming revenue generators. That was one of the issues that came out of Ferguson, where it was a huge part of the city budget, and it generated, over 3 warrants per household, mostly for minor traffic violations. One woman had a warrant for an overgrown lawn, which was actually a criminal offense. So those are very important areas. And so one of the things that's really been successful in states throughout the country is justice reinvestment, a strategy of instead of continuing to build more prisons and locking up people that we're not afraid of, taking some of that money and putting it into better law enforcement, better probation, where there's actually swift and certain sanctions, for example, as well as positive incentives, caseloads that are manageable, and real treatment programs. And so of course, now dozens of states have enacted justice reinvestment. Some of the greatest successes most recently was Utah last year. I just testified last week in Alaska, where they have a really excellent plan that's going forward that was developed by a commission which included prosecutors, law enforcement, judges, many other stakeholders. And so it's also a very collaborative process to look at the data and not have a predetermined set of policies, but see what that shows you in terms of what's driving the prison population, what the recidivism rates are, what programs are working, what aren't, and so forth. So as you go back and look at it, one of the things we've focused on is what states adopted justice reinvestment approaches several years ago, and what have the results been. And so North Carolina is one of those examples. In 2011, they adopted a comprehensive plan that did a number of things: reduced excessive sentences on low-level drug offenses, strengthened probation and treatment, limited technical revocations from probation for minor violations like missing a meeting, allowed probation officers to use county jail for weekend jail stays as a swift and certain sanction. Also made sure there was supervision of inmates being released without any supervision from prison, which nationally is a huge problem. More than a quarter of inmates are discharged without any follow-up, particularly when you have inmates who are on a number of mental health medications, just sending them out the door with no one keeping track of them, no one making sure they're having a continuity of care is a recipe for more recidivism. But since North Carolina did that in 2011, this justice reinvestment package, their crimes down 11%, their returns to prison are down 14%. They've closed 10 correctional facilities at a savings of $650 million. So South Carolina, Georgia, you can go down the list. There's tons of successes. But I think that as we look forward, one of the things is we're increasingly seeing policymakers, rather than seeing this issue as a 10-foot pole, which it was a decade or two ago, actually saying this is something I want to hold up to the public. So you saw, for example, Governor Nathan Deal in Georgia, Governor Kasich in Ohio, actually campaigning on the success of their justice reinvestment efforts. Wrapping up, and then I'll turn it over to Attorney General Cuccinelli. Some of the states, in addition to Alaska, which I mentioned, that we're focusing on currently include Maryland, where the Council of State Governments has a very good reinvestment plan that Governor Hogan is moving forward. Also, Illinois, where Governor Rauner has created a task force which has a goal of 25% reduction in the prison population, consistent, of course, with public safety. And also Oklahoma, where we are blessed now to have a full-time director, Adam Luck, who's pushing forward 5 different bills in the legislature. There's also a default mens rea bill in Oklahoma, but as well as some bills dealing with penalties for low-level offenses. And then one of the other states, of course, on the juvenile justice side is Kansas, which has a comprehensive juvenile justice reform bill pending that'll follow what Texas, New York, so many other states have done with a close-to-home approach, having more juveniles in programs closer to their families, to nonprofit groups and churches, mentors, where you actually get the best results, and you're not spending what frankly can be $300 or $400 a day in these large remote lockups that have really proven ineffective for juveniles. So there's so many areas we're working in, but that's kind of some highlights there. And at this point, I'm really delighted to turn it over to former Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, who I think is really someone who has brought so much to the Right on Crime effort, and has done countless speeches and op-eds and been active for us in many states. And we are really pleased to have him join us and share his thoughts with us today. Ken?
Well, Mark, I think anybody who hasn't spent time talking to you would say that was almost a world record subject matter coverage there, one right after the other. So everyone here on the call can tell that Mark has incorporated all of this. It's sort of in his bones at this point. He's a great resource for all of us. I would just offer a couple of strategic perspectives for you, and then pass it on to Joe. And that is, first of all, in terms of making progress, we are making significant progress, but it's happening in the states, and most particularly, and not surprising for us conservatives, it's happening in conservative states. We will hear from Joe. I'm a little curious about an update from today about how things are going at the federal level. But beyond that, when you look around the country for the last 10 years, and starting in Texas, and that's where Right on Crime began, with the Texas Public Policy Foundation there, and we have seen advances in criminal justice reform in Georgia, in the Dakotas, in the Carolinas, in state after state, in Pennsylvania when it was run by a Republican. I will say one of the things the Democrat governor did when he defeated Republican Tom Wolf was keep the Department of Corrections head who had done such a good job under the Republican governor, so Colbert. So we're seeing that kind of leadership coming from the right, and it has to come from the right. Forget all the public rhetoric you hear right now about criminal justice and so forth. Think about this. The American public doesn't trust the left to keep us safe. They believe the left just wants to let criminals out. And frequently, they're right. They do trust those of us on the right because we have a long track record, especially people. I've been an attorney general. We have prosecutors and other attorneys general that are part of the Right on Crime Coalition. Many other conservatives, including in law enforcement or formerly in law enforcement. It gives us credibility to actually stand up in front of a legislature, in front of a crowd, and say, public safety is my #1 priority. Well, the ACLU can't say that. President Obama can't say that. Most of our colleagues on the left cannot say that because it is not true. But for us, public safety is job one. And so all of the experience and the data you heard Mark rattling off to you there in machine gun fashion, that is real world experience. We tell people Right on Crime is evidence-based. We advance solutions that are evidence-based. It means we can prove that they work. And as a conservative, it's important to remember that the same kind of oversight, really skepticism, that conservatives bring to every other area of government. Should we be spending money here? Is it working? Can we do it better for less money? Those are the kinds of questions that conservatives just haven't naturally asked of public safety and law enforcement over the years. But we're asking those questions, and we're finding ways to keep people safer for less money, both conservative values. So we call it Right on Crime because we're conservatives, we're on the right, and we call it Right on Crime because our goal is to hit the bullseye. It's to get it right. It doesn't mean you electrocute shoplifters. It means you figure out what's the right punishment or penalty for each shoplifter, and so on up the scale of crime, all the way to murder, treason, and so forth. And is there a better way to avoid these crimes in the future? And what evidence is there that various ways we might try to do that? We typically talk about reducing recidivism, the rate with which people commit crimes after they're released from prison or after having already been convicted. Budgets are a bottom line number for us. Recidivism rates are a bottom line number for us. And crime rates are a bottom line number for us. That's what we focus on. And as we prove in more and more states that criminal justice reform done from a conservative perspective works. And what do we mean by works? Safer community, less money spent. The more we can show it works, the more we're likely to see it spread around the country. Now, I was a Virginia legislator, and a little story I like to tell is, can you imagine me standing on the floor of the Virginia Senate and waving a bill around and saying, this bill is the greatest thing since sliced bread. They've tried it in California and they love it. Well, that isn't going to sell in Virginia, I'll tell you that. But if I have the same bill and it's a good bill and based on the experience of others, and I'm waving that bill around and saying, you know, they've tried this in Texas and they love it. It works, it saves them money, and it's kept them safer. Well, you know what? I can get to the next sentence and still have a shot at convincing legislators. So the fact that conservatives and conservative states are proving the viability of the ideas that we are advancing at Right on Crime is absolutely critical to our ability to continue to succeed in spreading these ideas around the country and, frankly, encouraging others in various states to experiment and try new things that might work to reduce crime and increase public safety for less cost. We have bills going through the Congress right now that are variously good and bad, and it's a much uglier process in the federal level than it is in the states, or at least it's less pleasant. But we do face the problems Mark mentioned. The overcriminalization at the federal level is particularly pronounced, where regulation is dealt with as criminal violation, regulatory violations. A big discussion there is mens rea, intent, criminal intent, and our really demand. No one from Right on Crime should support a federal bill that does not provide for a criminal intent requirement. It is the single most important philosophical and real world improvement that I think we can make in the overcriminalization and over federalization of criminal law. So that's where we are. We have had success, as you heard from Mark. We have so much more to do, so much opportunity, really to bring people back who've made bad decisions. No one is beyond redemption. That's something that we believe very strongly at Right on Crime. But we have to push back on the rhetoric of the left, all while we advance the evidence that's been developed on the right as to the right path, both at the state level and the federal level. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Joe, who is going to give us what I hope is an update on what's going on at the federal level. He's been dealing with this day to day, and I'm better him than me. He has more patience than I do. And Joe, I'd love to hear what's been going on and whatever news you've got for us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ken. I appreciate it. And hello to everyone watching. Again, my name is Joe Lupino Esposito, and I'm a policy analyst for Right on Crime. Unlike a lot of the other folks who are part of our team that are based in Austin, Texas, I'm actually based up in Washington, D.C. We have a presence here and also in Oklahoma, as Mark mentioned earlier, with our state director, Adam Luck. And this has been the first physical expansion, I guess you could say, of Right on Crime. But as we know, Right on Crime has been very effective in over 40 states over the last several years. And now we're getting more and more engaged with the federal government. Having a presence here really helps us sort of make some inroads in states. Obviously, Ken's here in Virginia anyway, but Virginia, Maryland, and many other states on the East Coast where we can have a direct presence and really try to affect legislation and work as quickly as we can to get these changes made. I joined the team last May, and it was right in the midst of the negotiations on Capitol Hill about what federal justice reform should look like. And we've seen a lot of different ideas. Luckily, we've seen mostly the most popular ideas coming from Texas, coming from Georgia. These are the ideas that we know worked, as everyone has mentioned already. So we're looking at a number of different bills. There is some movement in the Senate for one bill that includes corrections and sentencing reform that we think is very strong. It's still in negotiations, as Ken mentioned. It's a very messy process. So we're hoping to hear more about that in the coming weeks. Hopefully not in the coming months, more like the coming weeks. And we do anticipate to see some changes that conservatives have asked for to ensure that there's public safety. But what we know from our experience in Texas and a number of other states is that these reforms do work. And the message that I want to push, and it's just sort of to double down on what Ken was just saying earlier, and we should all push this message, frankly, is that conservatives are the ones that are leading on criminal justice reform. We always have been. We have always been in favor of law and order, and none of that has changed. We've just found through research that doing things to divert people away from incarceration when necessary sometimes works better than just simply incarcerating them. So between this, prison programs, and other reforms, we're trying to put together the right solution. And at the federal level, it's difficult because there's not as close of a connection from members of Congress to the people that are in the prisons, to the communities that are affected by this. But I think what we're bringing to the table, along with some of our allies, such as Americans for Tax Reform, Freedom Works, and the Faith and Freedom Coalition, is that we're bringing the message that this has worked in other states, and there's no reason why the federal government shouldn't be doing this as well. I also just want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about mens rea reform and criminal intent. As it stands now, there is what we expect to be a package of bills going through the House of Representatives one of which is on mens rea and criminal intent. And it simply says that if there is no criminal intent written in a law, one will be applied. And they look at it in a more creative way, trying to say that there's essentially a higher level if it's something that's very obviously wrong, and a lower level if it's something that's minor and regulatory, like filing your paperwork, or my new favorite federal crime, negligently washing a fish in a non-fish washing sink in a national forest. So these are the type of things that are crimes for the federal government, and that's something that needs to change. So a lot of conservatives on the Hill, I think, in particular, which is really the most encouraging thing that I've seen, is that there are so many conservatives on the Hill that understand this issue and want this to be a part of any package that moves forward. I've been very encouraged by that. It's a big first step. This obviously doesn't cure everything. There are still plenty of laws that will still be a problem after a default mens rea standard is passed. But I think this is a big first step that I think will alert the public to these problems, and I think will lead to future changes. On that note, I should also remind everyone that we do have a new website on criminalintentfacts.com that talks about this issue. And we go into some of the state laws that have been passed. Most recently, Michigan has passed one that said that this is a problem and it needs to be taken care of. And there have been people on the left and right that have gotten behind these laws. I'll also just briefly speak about a little bit of what else is going on the Hill. There are bills regarding juvenile justice reform that are coming up both in the Judiciary Committees as well as Health and Workforce Committee, which our own Derek Cohen testified for back in the fall. And Mark was also brought for testimony over the summer to talk about some of the sentencing and prison reform bills as well. So, you know, unfortunately, there's not too much to update. The process is still moving. As I understand it, Senator Cornyn sent out a tweet earlier today saying that they were expecting new language on the Senate bill. So that's a very good sign, and I'm hopeful that that means we will see something soon, and preferably before Easter, before we all get swept up in presidential politics and all the rest. So I'll just close by just mentioning again that we have obviously our regular website, rightoncrime.com, and we also have our criminalintentfacts.com website. And if anybody has any other comments or questions, please send us an email. It's roc@texaspolicy.com. And we're always looking to hear from all of you. And we really appreciate that you joined us here today. And thanks for celebrating a bit with us for our I guess, our anniversary here. And I think things are going well, and they will continue to go well. So, Ken, were you motioning there for?
I was. Yes.
I'll let you take it.
All right. I would like to share with folks, we've talked a lot about the substance and the policies. I would like to talk to you a little bit about some of the politics of this, of messaging in particular. It has, because of some of the things the president has done and some of the rhetoric that has been coming out of the left, we have felt the need to really forcefully separate ourselves from that rhetoric. For instance, the president more or less announced that he released 6,000 people from prison. He didn't give a lot of details. He was just really happy to brag about letting people out of prison. And when we get associated, because we want criminal justice reform, with that sort of a policy, that sort of approach, that doesn't sound like good public safety to me. I'm sure it doesn't to you either. And you combine that with some of the rhetoric of the left, phrases like mass incarceration, and Jim Crow approaches to law, the racial divide, and they try to drive a wedge there. And we need to push back on that. And Right on Crime, I've been taking this up for months in my remarks across the country. I'll work with the ACLU and they'll support our efforts, but we're going to cast it from the perspective of conservatives. And we're not going to just stand there quietly while the ACLU does something else in terms of messaging. I have actively pushed back, as have others, on that sort of messaging from the left. Mass incarceration has not happened in this country since we put Japanese Americans in prison camps in World War II. We don't have mass incarceration going on. Yes, we do have more African Americans showing up in our prisons, but I would suggest to you that the single most important statistic in all of criminal justice is the correlation between broken families and criminal activity, likelihood of joining criminal activity. If you want to really fix crime in America, we're going to have to fix families. Crime doesn't cause broken families, but broken families do make it more likely that we will have crime. And we can never leave those communities behind, and the communities with the least family-centered opportunity for children to grow up are going to see higher rates of crime. One other racial fact, especially as it relates to police, I was late for this webinar today because I was just coming, literally racing back from a funeral for a police officer, and she was killed, and this is amazing, but she was killed on her first day on the job. She was sworn in last Friday, and she was killed responding to a domestic call on Saturday. 2 other officers were wounded, and this is real, and it doesn't happen because she's a woman or because of the race that she has or the assailant has. It happens because she's walking into one of the most difficult circumstances police officers have to deal with, and that's domestic situations, domestic disputes. The man also killed his wife before the police got there. Very violent, very unfortunate, very tragic. There's been a lot of rhetoric, really inaccurate rhetoric, surrounding the police and race in the last year and a half since Ferguson. Were there problems in Ferguson? Yes. Mark mentioned a few, like using the criminal justice system to raise money. I would suggest to you that that is not unique to Ferguson. That is, unfortunately, very widespread across the country. It also comes up in the area of civil asset forfeiture and criminal asset forfeiture. It doesn't seem like too much to ask if you're going to seize the proceeds of crime that there actually be a crime. And that's what we demand at Right on Crime, is a conviction before you do that. And we've pushed that in Virginia, and we've had success in other parts of the country. But those sorts of approaches are critically important. That's a different subject entirely. Think about that rhetoric. Think about actively pushing back. Don't just stand there and say, boy, I don't agree with that. Open your mouth, because the conservatives who aren't sure if criminal justice reform means going soft on crime or whether it means actually handling crime and criminal justice better need to hear from you that we reject that rhetoric. When you see a black criminal, you need to remember, statistically, you should be picturing the black crime victim. When you see a white criminal, statistically, it's overwhelming that they've had white crime victims, and the same for Hispanic and the same for Asian. It is far less common that people be targeted because of their race. Criminals target victims because they perceive the opportunity for success in whatever it is they're doing, whether it's assaulting children, whether it's stealing, whatever it is. They want to do what they want to do and not get caught and not have negative consequences. And we need to push back on that rhetoric. We need to set the record straight. We need to maintain our credibility with conservatives and with law enforcement by continually making it clear that public safety is our #1 priority. And as long as we keep doing that, we will have the opportunity to make our case. We will have the opportunity to present all the great evidence that has been put together under the Right on Crime umbrella as to why states can do better, as to why and how the federal government can do better. But we've got to win the message war, not just the information war. Mark here, Levin, is a tremendous weapon in the information war. But all of us have got to be weapons in the information war. Conservatives should own criminal justice reform, and it should be on our terms. I appreciate you all joining us. I don't know if Mark or Joe have anything to add, but I appreciate the ability to hit the messaging in addition to the strategic approach. Mark, Joe, not hearing anymore.
No, that's fantastic, and I think you make a great point. You know, President Obama is out there talking about this, but he's late to the party. Right on Crime has been there for years, and we need to keep reminding people of that. So I think that's a great message to end on, Ken. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.